Perceptible has it become? So I'm trying to do what Marcel Proust wanted us to do, which is try to find ways to retrieve the past so it isn't lost. So what this talk is about, or not about, it's about people, places, and events that are worth remembering or knowing. And what it's not about is the people in this room. So if I don't mention you, it's quite on purpose. So I want to start off with the days of Queen Victoria, who ruled for 64 years, a period of time that we hope maybe Elizabeth II will equal, but an important period at the end of her reign for medical mycology, because this is the time that people, physicians and pathologists, began to see things that they didn't understand, but they knew were new, and what they were describing were new, deep mycoses. And it's remarkable to me that in this short period you show here, between 1892 and 2008, 7 deep mycoses were described. And this includes paracoccidioidomycosis, described by Lutz, who retired from Germany to go down into South America, where he worked so hard as obviously he had no intent to retire. Coccidioidomycosis was described by a medical student, Posadas, in South America, as well as by Rixford and Gilchrist in California. Blastomycosis was described by Gilchrist, who was a dermatologist at Johns Hopkins. He later became head of dermatology at the University of Maryland. Cryptococcosis was described by 2 different papers, one by the physician who saw the patient who died, and the other by the pathologist who described the pathology. Sporotrichosis was described by another Hopkins dermatologist, Schenk, and histoplasmosis was described by a pathologist in Panama named Darling. And mycetoma, which had been known for centuries, was described as a fungal infection by Wright, all in this short period of time. The key to these discoveries is that people knew what was new. They didn't know what they were seeing, and they often got it wrong. They thought it was a parasite. And one of the oddities is when they were trying to culture cocci, they kept getting all this mold growing over everything, which of course was cocci, because people did not know that there was a dimorphic fungus. It's amazing, a testimony to human endurance that all those people trying to culture cocci didn't die of the mold that they were trying to have. So now I'm going to over the 20th century in a single slide. So for those of you who are too young or too distracted with their work to notice, I'm going to start off with the wars that we had and what they produced. So the 2 wars in 1914 and 1939 were waged against 2 countries, Germany and Japan, that are now our strongest trading partners and most strong political allies. In 1950, we went to the defense of Korea against the Chinese and North Koreans, and now we have from them cars, like the rental car I drove down here, as well as electronics that many of us have in our cell phones, including this exploding cell phone from Samsung, a recent gift. In 1961, we went to war with Vietnam, and now we have Vietnamese restaurants scattered all over, as well as I want to point out that Barack Obama's Trans-Pacific Partnership, which both presidential candidates have vowed to not push. But if it goes through, our former enemy will be one of our trading partners on a favorite nation's schedule. Grenada we invaded because we thought they were going to become another Cuba, so we sent down in Operation Urgent Fury 9,000 troops for a population of 91,000. So we had for every 10 civilians 1 armed forces member, and were able to end that conflict in less than 2 weeks. And the end result of this has been the University of St. George's advertised that they have put 31,000 medical graduates in practice in the United States. So we saved the future of American physicians by invading Grenada and taking it away from the communists. The other important invasion was 1989. We went down to Panama for Operation Just Cause. And the just cause was because Noriega had allowed the banks. Now, Noriega was a paid CIA informant, by the way, before he became president of Panama. And the trouble was he allowed the banks in Panama to process drug company money. So we invaded Panama, took him out of office, brought him to the U.S., put him on trial, put him in jail, and as the Panama Papers showed, they're still laundering drug money in Panama. But that was the end result of that. So the other major events were the stock market crash, the Great Depression, the New Deal, which put Americans digging the canals in my home state of Arizona, as well as building bridges, highways, and post offices. But the big deal was the discovery by Bayer in 1935 of the first antibacterial. And this was done by a chemist in Bayer, the sulfadiazine, sulfa products. And then in the 1940s, we had the advent of the penicillins, the streptomycins, and the corticosteroids entered clinical use. But during this first half of the century, mycoses were thought to be very rare, untreatable, and largely discovered of interest at an autopsy. So here's some more mid-century details now. This was a period where medical mycology reference centers began to arise. These centers did cultures, did research, they trained researchers, they ran courses, they provided clinical advice, and one of these was the Pasteur Institute in Paris with the three musketeers named Drouet, Maria, and Seguin. And I'll come back to those in a moment. At CDC, Libero, also called Leah Yellow, was a world-renowned mycologist who could identify new species and identify things for mycologists around the world. Leo Kaufman was also a very well-known serologist, Kaplan, a pathologist, and Lucille George did a little bit of everything with bacteria and fungi. At Columbia, we had Rhoda Benham, who for the first time identified what a cryptococcus was and what it wasn't, and identified many other yeasts that put us on the track to understanding yeast taxonomy much better. At NIH, Chester Evans came and set up a laboratory which eventually June Kwan Chung and I have inherited, and others that follow us. At Duke, Norman Conant made Duke University the center for many efforts in mycology, a heritage that I think we can say is well carried on now by Joe Hyman and John Perfect. I want to show you this picture about these three men and tell you a small story. This picture shows on your far left Edouard Drouet, who was single, and then Mira and Seguin and their wives at the meeting in Evisham in Salsa Maggiore in Italy. And the story I'm going to tell you is about, I was on a plane from Switzerland to the United States, and I had a switch in Paris, in Charles de Gaulle, except they canceled my flight. So I was in Paris, and the airline was totally disinterested in helping me find a hotel room. So I got on the phone to find that the hotels were occupied with a huge fashion show that was going on in Paris. And while I was standing talking on the phone, someone stole my bag from behind me. So now I had no place to stay, no baggage, and no ticket. So I called Edouard Drouet, who I knew a little bit. In the early evening, he came, picked me up, took me back to his apartment, gave me a size pajamas, 2 sizes too small, put me up in his guest room, woke me up in the morning with the strongest coffee I've ever had in my entire life, took me to the airport, and saw me off. That's not, my story, I'm sure, is only typical of what many people saw in these people who were respected, admired, and liked. And the Pasteur Institute became a center for teaching young people, and Bertrand Dupont, recently retired, took over the job of Edouard Drouet as a clinician admitting patients to the Pasteur Hospital. And now Françoise Dromer, Paul Leger, and Olivier Grothulari, I think, carry on the tradition of mycology at the Pasteur. So here are some more mid-century details. There were a lot of people who became readily available in training and reference centers. They're trained in general mycology or in mycology. And just to run through a little list of these people, in the United Kingdom, there was Jimmy Gentles, who knew more about dermatophytes than anyone else. Phyllis Stockdale, who knew more anything about most fungi than anyone else. In Brussels, in Belgium, a man named Van Bruegem, a man who seemed like a big bear who would yell at anyone and would bite, but is actually a very kindly gentleman who trained many important mycologists in Belgium. In the Sudan, there was El Sheikh Mahmoud, who told us more about mycetoma that we've ever learned ever since then. In Germany, Fritz Steib wrote dozens of little tiny papers that were extremely insightful. And one of his little discoveries was made by feeding canaries Cryptococcus. And he noticed that when he cultured the stool of the canaries, the cryptococci were brown. And he figured out that's because he was feeding the canaries Gizionia abyssinica. And it was the first discovery of melanin, which has gone on to interest Peter Williamson and Joe Hyman and many others. So moving on here, in Los Angeles, Dexter Howard trained many good people at UCLA. Milton Huppert was the go-to person for the Veterans Administration at Wadsworth, VA. And Victor Newcomer was an extraordinary dermatologist describing dermatophytes. At the AFIP, a man named Chapman Binford was the one you went to if you had tissue that had a fungus in it. He could identify it. In Basel, Hans Scholler and Anne-Marie Pollack did fine work on identifying Candida and genetics, and as well as work on flucytosine. In South America, Pablo Negroni, Angelo Restrepo. Angelo, by the way, is still hard at work. And Dante Borelli and Juan McKinnon. In Australia, David Ellis, who recently retired. Now we're moving into the second half of the last century. And a strange thing happened. That is, a small advent was made by Chester Emmons. And what he did was he took some histoplasma capsulatum and put it in a culture that swished around on a stand for a long period of time. And what he was doing what old tuberculin had done. People took Mycobacterium tuberculosis, put it in a non-allergenic media, and swished it around on a shaker for a long period of time and called it old tuberculin. And that diluted 1 to 10 or 1 to 100 showed us how common it was to be exposed to TB. And our PPD we use now is simply a purified derivative of old tuberculin. So what Chester Emmons did, he made old histo. By putting this histo swirling around, he took the supernatant and gave it to Charlie Palmer, who found out for the first time that histo was actually a very common disease. For two drugs, dalbavancin and digilofungin. But they bought the company, lock, stock, and barrel, then fired everybody, from the people who emptied the trash to the vice presidents. But they got the patents. What they didn't have was anybody who knew anything about the drug. So basically, for the next 10 years, it kind of sat around while they're trying to go, now what do we do? But fortunately, they've moved on eventually. But I think firing everybody from Vicodin wasn't one of their smarter moves. Let me comment about the advent of multicenter trials. One of the things that were noted way back at the beginning was that people were not, in medical mycology, were not working together. That was true at the bench level, and it was also true at the clinical level. One of the exceptions was during and after World War II, the VA and armed forces had been working on tuberculosis, and they turned to working on histoplasmosis and did some very good trials way back then. An important clinical trial was done by the Medical College of Virginia and the University of Virginia. They wanted to try a combination of flucytosine and amphotericin B based on some in vitro work that Jerry Medoff had done at St. Louis. And they decided they would use a low dose of amphotericin B and what was considered now a high dose of flucytosine, 150 milligrams per kilogram. And in this trial, they enrolled 15 patients, and 13 lived and were considered successes. And that was very exciting. So a group of us, a total of 16 centers, got together, and we decided to run a multi-center trial. NIH was able to sponsor travel for the participants and provide a statistician, David Alling, for the trial. And we got together and we decided to run a trial. And we were asking the question, would the combination be at least as good as amphotericin B? And could it be given for a shorter period of time? Everyone was treated cryptomeningitis for 10 weeks, and as was done in many trials. But we decided we would try with amphotericin a low dose, like the recipe that had been given to us from the University of Virginia. But we couldn't decide on the amphotericin dose. Some wanted to use 0.3 milligrams, others 0.5, so it was decided to use 0.4 milligrams per kilogram of the amphotericin, but continue it for 10 weeks. we were able to finally enroll and study a total of 66 patients. Now, some people think that trial showed that the combination was better. No, it showed it was not inferior, and that had been the goal of the study. It was noted that the cultures became more rapidly negative with the combination, but it was not a better result than giving amphotericin at the dose we were using. There was a man at William named Bill Jordan, who was an ID doc, who ran at NIH the Division of Microbiology and Infectious Disease. And he noted what had happened with this collaborative trial and noted what he thought was the general pathetic state of mycology. And he got together a group of investigators, clinicians, mycologists. He brought them to NIH for a workshop. This was chaired by Milton Huppert. And the committee, after meeting for a few days, reported the lack of funding and training in the field. And most NIH funding was going on non-pathogenic fungi, particularly Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So the following year, NIAID decided to fund what they called the NIAID Mycoses Study Group. And they put out a contract, 5-year contracts, that went from the years 1978 up until 2006. And the idea was to get together a consortium of universities and industry people as well as government people to see what we could come up with for the better treatment of fungal diseases. So these contracts ended in 2006, but it was a unique collaboration at that time. And there have been independent meetings then continued to 2013, then annually with the CAC, and obviously now beginning with the biennial meetings. So the end of the era, big pharma support, and this was particularly true of Pfizer, reaches an all-time high with clinical trials, meetings, and more meetings, and research support. And then industry support started to fade, like the Chester cat in Alice in Wonderland, who slowly disappeared, only leaving the smile and disappearing all but the grin. I noticed that Pfizer is not one of the current sponsors, but fortunately there are some very good commercial sponsors for this meeting, showing that industry has certainly not lost all their interest in the field of mycology. So susceptibility testing during the end of the last century became respectable thanks to the work of Frank Oz, John Rex, John Galgiani, and NCCLS, which is now called the CSLI. And collaboration among medical mycologists, which was cited by the group in 1978 as being absent, has now become the standard operating procedure. So for my last slide, looking back, what did we see? Effective antifungals were a major driver of support for medical mycology. Collaborative clinical trials advanced the field, but I must say, looking back, Cryptococcus was low-hanging fruit. That was much easier than the job we have today studying aspergillosis or mucormycosis. The science base began as keen observations by mycologists and clinicians, often working together. A small number of gifted men and women trained the future leaders who trained the leaders who trained the leaders. So it's a cautionary tale for the present that we should seek out and nurture trainees who will follow us and keep this exciting area of science moving forward. And with that, I'll end my talk, and thanks for your attention.